Hello and welcome to episode 8 of Chrontendo. Today we'll be chronicling the good, the bad, and the ugly games for the Famicom in spring of 1986. We will be having a couple pretty big games this episode, but before we get into those, I'd like to discuss something I mentioned in last episode. I proposed a theory that the Famicom couldn't really go very long at all without having a game that's either a shoot-'em-up or that features ninjas. So by my estimation, we should be having a shoot-'em-up or a game with ninjas, or rather both, in at least every episode of Chrontendo. How do past episodes fit into this theory? Well, starting with episode 3, I see that there actually were 2 shoot-'em-ups, Xurion and Formation Z, and then one ninja game, Ninja-kun. Episode 4 had 2 shoot-'em-ups, Star Force and Gaimos, but unfortunately, no ninja games. Episode 5 had Sky Destroyer, which is more or less a shoot-'em-up, and of course, Ninja Jajamaru-kun. Episode 6 had a whole bunch of shoot-'em-ups, Galg 1942, the Macross game, as well as Iki, which featured ninja enemies. And again, Episode 7 had a whole slew, about 5 shoot-'em-ups, as well as Ninja Hattori-kun. So from now on, we'll be keeping an eye out for shoot-'em-ups and ninjas. We'll see how this episode fares at the end of the episode. And something else that is worth mentioning, we've seen the number of original games for the Famicom be slowly increasing. There's usually been a few each episode. This episode will actually mark the first time that the number of original games exceeds the number of ports since the Famicom started using outside developers and publishers. We will actually see 8 original games to 7 ports. In other words, at this stage, the number of titles being created for the Famicom is now exceeding those being brought in from other systems such as the arcade or computers. Well, the first game this episode is a bit of a stinker. It's Tag Team Pro Wrestling. For some reason in the US the title was changed to Tag Team Wrestling. This is a port of the 1983 Technos game. It was actually released by Data East. Really one of the first wrestling games for the arcade. Sort of an interesting title, but nothing too spectacular. Apparently this Famicom version was ported by SAS Sakata. As you can see, it doesn't really look much like the original arcade game. Graphically, it's quite crude looking. At least the players don't run around with their arms up in the air all the time like the arcade version. Well, how does the game play? Well, this is a bit different than a fighting type game. How it actually works is you need to run up to the opponent, grab him, hit the button, and then use your other button to select your attack. And you have to do this pretty quickly. You use the button to scroll through a variety of attacks, choose the one you want to perform, and then hit the other button again. Occasionally you will get pinned. It's difficult to see in the video, but the little box appears letting you know what attack you currently have selected. Interesting idea, doesn't always work out that well. Because this is tag team, you can run over and get your partner to jump into the ring. I guess the best thing we can say about this game is it's considerably better than Kaneko Man, but still it doesn't really play that well. It does have 2 different viewpoints, inside the ring and outside the ring. You do need to get back in the ring before the timer runs out. There I've actually pinned the opponent. And the winner is my team, the Ricky Fighters. Yes, the teams in this game have utterly ridiculous names. Ricky Fighters and of course the Strong Bads. If this game is known for anything nowadays, it might be the name Strong Bad, which of course became the name of a character in the web comic Homestar Runner. In Japan, this game was released by Namco for some reason. In the US, by Data East. I should also point out this was one of the very first third-party games to be released for the NES in the US. Love that stupid little dance they do when they win. So this came out in the end of 1986, around the same time as some Capcom titles, as well as some Bandai titles. So this means that the NES had 2 mediocre wrestling games right at the beginning of its popularity. Well, that's a very cool opening title screen there. This is Nazo no Murasame Jō, which means something along the lines of Mystery at Rainy Castle. Legend of Zelda, the first original FDS title, came out on February 21st, and almost 2 months later, we finally get the second original title for the FDS. I suppose folks who purchased the new system may have been getting a little bit impatient. Was it worth the wait? Well, maybe. This is certainly not a bad game. It's certainly not up to the level of Legend of Zelda, that's for sure. Apparently this game was delayed quite a bit. It was originally supposed to come out around the same time as Zelda. Unlike Zelda, this game was not directed by Miyamoto, and it was never released in the United States, one of the relatively few early Nintendo-developed titles not to be. Perhaps they felt its medieval Japanese subject matter would not really be suitable for Western audiences. So what is the plot of this game? Well, apparently some sort of mysterious object, a meteorite alien creature of some sort, has landed at Murasame Castle and caused various problems. Thus you are a young samurai who's sent by the shogun to investigate and fix the problem. Along the way, you'll encounter many ninjas. You have to make your way through 5 castles. This is the first one right here, is indicated by the little icon in the upper right corner. Penetrate the castle, rescue the princesses, and defeat the boss. Then move on to the next one. This game is vaguely Zelda-like. As you can see, it's quite a bit faster paced than Zelda. The enemies move pretty quickly, you fire off all kinds of crazy shots. The little ninjas are constantly popping up everywhere. You might actually say this game sort of resembles Zelda, only without the overworld. Imagine if Zelda was just a series of more or less linear dungeons, as opposed to an exploration type world. For each castle, you start off in the grounds around the castle, finally entering the castle itself. Here we're now actually in the castle. Just like Zelda, it's a series of interconnected rooms. Sometimes there are various paths you can take. You'll have to go down a path, find something, then double back. Eventually you make your way to the end. The castles are not enormous. They're perhaps similar in size to some of the dungeons in Zelda. You can find various sorts of objects. There's actually a lot of hidden objects here. You have to actually walk over them in order to reveal them. These are mostly weapons, power-ups, healing items, etc. For example, there's something right there to give you the ability to shoot fire 4 ways. That was supposed to be a princess, but when I tried to rescue her, she turned into a demon. That occasionally happens. When you die, you lose all your power-ups. This game is reasonably well designed. It controls pretty well. There's a wide variety of enemies. You have to sort of use different tactics to take them down. Here I'm getting close to the boss. These little guys shooting waves of, well, I don't know what it is, electricity at you. You can actually take 3 hits before you lose a life. You actually see the little red square up the upper center there. That's, see, now I'm back up to 3 hits again. 1 goes down every time you get hit by something. Luckily, you can often take out the various ninja throwing stars that are being thrown at you. You can, when you come close to an opponent, instead of throwing your star at him, you actually slice him with your sword. Some enemies, such as the samurai, for example, can only be killed this way. You can't kill them with a throwing star. Ah, here comes the first boss right here. Nothing too difficult. The bosses do get quite a bit more hard to kill later in the game. This game is certainly not the masterpiece that Super Mario or Zelda was, and there really aren't any puzzles in this game. Like I said, it's actually pretty linear. I've now completed the first castle, and I will move on automatically to the second. Ah, there we go. The 5th castle is actually Murasame Castle itself. Occasionally ninjas will throw little explosives or something at you. And of course each level gets a little bit trickier. Really it's interesting that Nintendo is repeating itself so early. This is basically, as I mentioned, sort of a dumbed down version of Zelda. It's fun for a little while, but you probably will not find yourself hooked. Time for our first of 2 shoot-'em-ups this episode. This is Argus. And with a name like Argus, you might think this is sort of inspired by Xevious, and you are right. This is a port of the 1986 arcade game, actually developed by NMK, a rather obscure Japanese arcade developer. This is the arcade version right here. Pretty decent graphics. This game is playable, I suppose, but it's hardly a classic. There were certainly better shooters coming out at this time. And here is the Famicom version. Now this game, as I mentioned, was actually very similar to Xevious in style and in pace. It's added a few extra things. For example, these little floating obstacles are in a way you have to shoot out. If you hit those gray things, you will explode. The enemies in this game are perhaps a bit tougher than those in Xevious. They have a tendency to sort of sneak up behind you, as you can see here. There's also power-ups in this game. If you use your bomb, you can shoot out various letters, such as B, for example, for shield. If you get, I believe, 3 of them, you will get the power-up. For example, I'm going to get my 3rd B right here. And I get a temporary invincible shield around my ship. I can't fire my gun, I just walk into things, blow them up. There's the first level boss. All you have to do is drop a bomb on him right in the middle there, and he's gone. So far so good. Here's the rather irritating part of the game. After each level, you have to land the ship on a landing strip. Unlike games like Capcom's 1940 series where you just land automatically, you actually have to use your D-pad to bring your ship down. You have to go along the little landing curve there shown in that transparent overlay, and if you do it wrong, come down too fast or too slow, you will blow up. You might be refreshed by a game in which you don't transform into a giant robot. Actually you can. At one point you will see a second shadow. If you intersect with that shadow, you'll temporarily transform into a giant robot that's invincible, only for a few seconds though. This is certainly not a horrible game. One thing about it is it's slow, not the slow pace, but your ship actually moves very slowly. Usually you crash when you sort of are trying to get around something and can't quite get around it quickly enough. This makes the game not horrible, but rather frustrating. Here we have another Famicom original, Nazo no Atlantis, The Mystery of Atlantis, from Sunsoft, the same company that bought us that 8-bit atrocity, Super Arabian. This is perhaps not quite as bad as Super Arabian, but certainly not far behind. One thing that is interesting about this game, and of course this is one of those Japanese games where bird shit can kill you, is that it is in fact one of the very first titles sort of obviously be inspired by Super Mario Bros. Some of the levels have a definitely sort of a Super Mario feel to them. Some of the enemies almost seem ripped right off. One thing this game does have is a very tight time limit. As you can see here, I'm rapidly running out of time. Yep, that tends to happen to you in this game. This game has a reputation for being very hard. However, this game is not legitimately difficult, it's just hard to control. One thing you learn right away is that, especially in the opening levels, little bombs you throw are useless for actually killing enemies. If you actually try to kill those hermit crabs there, you will never make it. Rather, you throw your bombs, they will hide, and you can actually walk right through them while they're hiding. One very bad thing about this game is the controls are not at all tight. In fact, especially the jumping is extremely difficult to get where you want to be. This game tries to be like Super Mario Bros., but fails completely for, among other reasons, the extremely weird jumping controls. here you can actually use your little bombs to kill someone. So this game has a number of levels. I'm not really sure how many. I've never played the game all the way through. Maybe no one has. This game is very unfun and not at all enjoyable to play. I think I've been through like around level 27. One interesting thing about the game, the only interesting thing about the game, is the fact that some levels have multiple exits, which mean you can actually choose which level you want to go on to next. Despite this game being incredibly lame, it was actually considered for American release by Activision as Super Pitfall 2. It's really hard to say what they were thinking. Here's an example of the extremely frustrating platforming activity in the game. I was able to get through this level with some practice, but man, the jumping on this is certainly not intuitive. On Super Mario Bros. You could probably whiz right through this because when you jump you know when you're going to land. This game, not so easy. So this is not the worst game Sunsoft ever made. It's enjoyable for about 10 minutes longer than Super Arabian, which is enjoyable for about 1 minute. Still, unless you have a masochistic love for bad platformers, avoid this game. And our next title is yet another Toes-developed title, published by Bandai. This is Gegege no Kitaro, Youkai Daimakyou. This was based on a popular 60s Japanese manga, and there just happened to be a cartoon series on air in Japan at the time this game came out. The main character, Kitaro, is a yokai that is sort of a Japanese demon ghost type thing from Japanese folklore. The little eyeball is actually his father. Kitaro himself is missing one eye. I'm not really sure what this game is about, but probably has something to do with Kitaro and his good yokai friends defeating some bad demons or something like that. The Gegege of the title is a Japanese exclamation of surprise or disgust, and the Daimakyou is a great demon world or something along those lines. This game is structured sort of like Zelda. You start off on an overworld, you enter a little dungeon, and then you have to defeat a certain number of enemies before completing the dungeon. Then you're back on the overworld and do the next one. Of course, there actually are no enemies on the overworld, and the game is completely linear. You move along a path, and there's usually about 4 or 3 dungeons. Once you get through all 3 or 4, you then have to go to the final one to defeat a boss. On this particular dungeon, you actually have to defeat a certain number of enemies before you can escape. There's a little counter, little skull, with a number shows how many you have left. Then the doors appear, and either you end up back on the overworld, or if you chose the wrong door, you're in this little demon world here where you have to get up to the top, and then you'll be back in the overworld. Here I've defeated the 3rd dungeon, go past the little shrine, and now I'm here to face the boss. For fans of the series, I'm sure a lot of the enemies and various objects in this mean something. For people who aren't familiar with the series, really, I'm sure this game means nothing at all to them. So here's the 2nd level, and we're back again into the 1st dungeon. The dungeons, well, the types of levels do repeat, like so there's only 4 of them. The backgrounds will often be different, however, to give the game a little bit of variety. In this level, you actually have to use that little flame following around behind you to light all the candles in the room. Some of the power-ups are a little weird, like for example, you can actually throw your hand. Being a ghost, I guess you can do those kind of things. Your main weapon is actually your hair, which you can shoot out like needles. Something else that's helpful is during the boss battles you can actually call on your little spirit friends to help you. For example, on the first, this boss battle right here, I'm actually going to call on a guy who's like a little stone wall that'll prevent some of the boss's attacks from hitting you. Not all of them, however. Now in the US, of course, they'd never really heard of this little series, so the game was completely changed for the American release, changed to Ninja Kid. The main character was changed, and a few of the items were changed. All the enemies and levels are pretty much the same, though. You have little throwing stars instead of using your hair. Your character has like the same sort of idiotic-looking face that you saw in Chubby Cherub, which may annoy some people. This game seems to sort of fall prey to the usual Toza mishaps. It doesn't control very well. It feels like your character is walking around on ball bearings all the time. The platforming is a little weird. You sometimes fall right through the platforms. The hit detection's a little strange. Additionally, this game does seem overly complicated at times, just in terms of the number of items and various objects you sort of have to collect. They don't really enhance the gameplay. It's more like the developers needed to add them because they felt that after Super Mario Bros. Games had to have a whole lot of extra stuff in them. This game seems somehow stuck between the past and the present. It's both very simple and repetitive, yet strangely cluttered at the same time. Gegege no Kitaro is more of a historical curiosity than anything else. Next up, we have another game from Taito, Kage no Densetsu, or The Legend of Kage. And this is actually a port of their 1985 arcade game, in which you play sort of a ninja kind of guy who has to rescue a kidnapped princess. Well, there you go. And this game is interesting in the sense that you can jump around quite a bit. It actually features a lot of scrolling, very high vertical ceiling on this game, and you can pretty much jump around and run around like crazy and kill people. So it is in fact a reasonably fun game. Here we have the introduction for the Famicom version, and you're off. Now, Kage uses ninja throwing stars and little swords, sort of like ninjas do, but I guess he's not actually a ninja, just someone who knows ninja techniques, unless he's one of those ninjas who's so badass he doesn't actually have to run around in a black outfit. He can walk around in shorts and a red cloak. The object of this first level here is basically to just kill a bunch of people, including, I believe, around 3 fire-breathing monks. Once you actually get rid of the monks is when you move on to the next level. There really is no finish or start of this level. The monks will sort of appear at any point randomly, so you can sort of run around. Now you saw me grab a little glowing orb there. This will change the color of your robe from red to green, and will give you an ability to take one hit without dying. The first hit will actually just change you back into red. The second one will change you yellow. Again, green and yellow seem like sort of inappropriate colors for ninja-like dudes, but I guess this guy knows what he's doing. I believe this game has a total of 4 levels. This first one here in the forest. There's 2 very short levels. The second level is where you simply have to kill 10 people. One thing you can get are these little scrolls, and when you start reading them will sort of instantly kill any ninjas that come near it. It's sort of like a can of raid for ninjas. This doesn't really help you get to the level at all, but it does help you rack up some extra points. Once the scroll is finished being read, the game continues just as normally. In the second level you need to kill 10 people, in the third level you merely need to get to the top of the level. So actually, they're both the second and third levels are actually very short. The fourth level you're inside the castle and you need to find the princess. Basically it mostly involves just running up a couple flights of stairs. Here's the second level right here. And here's the fourth level. Now one thing that's a little bit unusual for this time period is once you cut the princess's ropes, the game then goes into like a cutscene. It's still pretty unusual for video games to have cutscenes right in the middle of the action. This is basically like a pre-boss cutscene here. The fellow just jumps off the roof, escaping with Princess Pin, and next thing you know, you think you would have been paying a bit more attention. And then you fight the first boss, which is these 2 sort of ghost white monks. You can't actually kill them, you have to hit the butterfly until the butterfly is dead. Doesn't really make much sense to me, but perhaps it's some kind of medieval mystical Japanese thing. As you can see, if you try, you can whack on the actual monks all you want, but you won't do anything. Once you've dispatched the monks, the game then repeats, this time in fall, and with a new boss at the end. You can actually get a little power-up, sort of this multi-throwing star thing here. Killing ninjas will occasionally give you this little power-up icon. And that is Legend of Kage, a fun game, but like all games of this nature, your mileage may vary. Next up we have Dig Dug 2 by Namco. For some reason, however, this was released by Bandai in the United States. I guess Namco and Bandai have had some kind of relationship with each other for a long time. They actually released that Macross game together. Eventually, of course, Bandai and Namco merged into one company, but that was, years after this game came out. Well, when this game is a port of a 1985 arcade game, and it kind of makes you wonder, was there actually like a nostalgia in 1985 for the earlier days of video gaming? Because this game must have seemed rather odd in the arcades in 1985. It really plays more like a game from the early 1980s. Why Namco decided of all things to come out with a new Dig Dug game in 1985 is anyone's guess. Dig Dug 2 wasn't very successful in the arcades. The arcade version really didn't look much different than this. This one actually replicates the graphics pretty good. In Dig Dug 2, you are armed with both your air pump and a jackhammer. You can use your jackhammer along the fault lines there in order to throw a piece of the island into the ocean. The smallest piece will always be the piece that falls into the ocean. You can use this to eliminate large groups of enemies all at once, as we've done here. Now, the game is actually pretty simple up to around level 10. Suddenly it gets much harder. Starting with this level, well, I see a whole bunch of monsters pretty much charge you almost instantly. The best strategy I can find is to try to sort of loosen up that one large chunk of the island there. Unfortunately, it's actually quite difficult, simply because they move so fast. Eventually I was able to get through it, but it took me quite a few tries. After that, the levels remain relatively difficult, mostly because the monsters are moving so incredibly fast. In some ways, Dig Dug 2 almost resembles a puzzle game, meaning that you have to look at each island, analyze where the best place to use your jackhammer is, and then hurry up and do it. It might take a few tries for each new level. Some of them are definitely not at all obvious. Also, of course, you can fall into the ocean while you're jackhammering. You sort of have to use the D-pad to sort of push your guy over to the right direction, otherwise he might just fall right in. And of course, well, I actually fell in right there. Remembering that Dig Dug 2 was not an old game when this Famicom version came out, it was only a year old, less than a year old. They actually added a lot of things to the Famicom versions, more levels actually. I believe the arcade original had 32 levels. The Famicom actually has 72 different levels. Dig Dug 2 is a reasonably fun game, but sort of lacks the charm of the original. We've already seen a couple Super Mario Bros. Inspired platformers for the Famicom, but Mighty Bomb Jack is probably the first one that actually works well as a game. This is a Famicom-only sequel to an arcade game called Bomb Jack. The object of the Bomb Jack is to jump around these little screens and pick up bombs, avoiding the enemies. Mighty Bomb Jack was the first game that Timco published themselves for the Famicom, and they really put a lot of work into it, and the game actually plays very well. You control Jack just exactly the same way you do in the arcade game. You can jump up, and you can slow him down by pressing the B button as he's falling. However, this game is quite a bit different than the original. You're still collecting bombs, of course, for points, but you can collect a whole lot of other things as well. The object is to make your way through this pyramid, there's I believe 17 levels altogether, and rescue the royal family. You'll see that you're collecting those little pink coins with the Bomb Jack face on them. Those are power-ups, which you can use a little bit later in the game. You'll see that enemies are constantly spawning, and of course you need to avoid those. Eventually you'll find a way to the end of the passage, and then you'll move on to the next level. Within a few levels, the monsters are actually spawning quite quickly. That little power-up I collected there will temporarily transform any enemies on screen into what are supposedly gold coins, though to me they look more like antacid tablets. There are various hidden objects and hidden treasures throughout the game. You find them by jumping on them, then they will appear as little treasure chests. This first level is quite simple, but as we get further into the game it does become quite non-linear, with various sort of differing branches you can take, and there are several paths to get all the way to the end. There's also a lot of stuff that's relatively hard to find as well. Your object is to rescue the royal family, but in order to rescue all of them you'll need to find special objects that are pretty well hidden. In between levels, we actually do this right here. This is basically like a recreation of the original Bomb Jack game. You're supposed to collect bombs, preferably in order. You get a bonus if you get them in the order that the fuses are lit. For example, the one on the upper right hand is the next one we want to get. That little power-up floating around is the one that'll turn all the monsters into gold coins. We'll try to grab that because it'll make it a lot easier. And of course there's little bonus coins as well that appear from time to time. Once you've collected all the bombs you can escape the room and then go on to level 2. Now as mentioned, there are a lot of hidden things. For example, there are little Sphinx figures that when you collect them will open hidden doors. There's one right there. This actually unlocked a door a little bit later in the level. Once I find my way how to get to that door, we'll go through it. Notice those pink chests. When you activate one of your mighty coins, and currently we have 9, you'll be able to temporarily open the pink chests, which have some better treasures in them. Once we get into the hidden room there, we'll actually find some high point items as well as an extra life. One thing you might not like about Mighty Bomb Jack is it's actually relatively hard. The game is pretty complicated. You won't be able to find everything the first time you play it. This is definitely a game that you'll have to do some work on. One thing about this is you can only collect 9 mighty coins at a time. If you accidentally grab a 10th coin, you'll be sent to the torture room. In this room, you're stuck here until you jump 50 times. And of course, monsters start coming down, making it quite difficult for you to jump. It's very easy to lose a life in the torture room. So in other words, you're prevented from hoarding the mighty coins. You can't just grab a whole bunch, you have to actually use them very sparingly. The more you play this game, the more you realize how good it actually is, especially compared to the Bandai games we've been seeing developed by Toza. This game is difficult, it's well made, it controls well, and it's pretty sophisticated. Definitely the best Super Mario inspired game we've seen so far on the Famicom. The second shoot-'em-up we have this episode, and far and away the better of the two, is a port of Konami's 1985 game, Gradius. Gradius, along with Capcom's 1942, is one of a handful of shoot-'em-ups that came out in the arcades around this time that sort of revolutionized the genre and sort of ushered in like a new era for shoot-'em-ups. One of Gradius' big innovations was the way it handled power-ups. In this case, you collect little icons after shooting certain ships. You can then use those to buy certain power-ups. For example, right now we can buy the speed up power-up. If we'd like to collect more, we can get double, laser, multiple, or the question mark. Konami, unlike Capcom, seems to have actually ported this game themselves rather than having some other company like Micronix do it. As a result, it actually plays very good. While the graphics are not quite as nice, and the ship does handle a little differently, you won't really be completely lost playing the Famicom version if you've already played the arcade version. It's similar enough that there's not a whole lot of difference. Even the bosses look pretty good. Gradius was noted for having large, impressive-looking bosses, which is sort of becoming kind of a trend at this point in shoot-'em-up games. And while the Famicom version can't quite replicate that, this is certainly not bad looking here. Here, of course, you're trying to shoot out the core. Once you do that enough times, this guy will finally blow up. And then we're on to the next level. Around this time, of course, programmers were learning how to get, more and more out of the Famicom hardware. Of course, there are a few technical issues with this game. It does slow down occasionally. We'll see an example of that in just a second. You have these large tentacle creatures that use up quite a few sprites. When two of them come on the screen at the same time, you do get some pretty serious slowdown here, and actually makes the game quite difficult to play because it's rather hard to get your ship out of the way in time. Other than that, though, the game does play very smoothly, even with all the bullets, lasers, and enemies on the screen at once. There's actually quite a bit going on in some of these levels, as you can see, and the game is able to handle quite well most of the time. Compared to other shoot-em-ups released on the Famicom so far, this is really very impressive. Here we have the question mark power-up here, which is actually like a little shield, quite necessary when it comes to certain things. This last boss right here actually isn't the last boss, it's a sub-boss. It doesn't look quite as impressive as it does in the arcade game, but still is rather nice and creepy looking. This game does a surprisingly good job of replicating the arcade experience. Now, this particular port is noted for one other thing as well, and that is in fact that it is the first appearance of the famous Konami code. If you press pause, then enter in down, down, up, up, left, right, BA, you will find yourself powered up completely. This can get you out of a tight situation, but you can only use it once in the game. We're not sure why this code was entered in. Probably it was used for testing and then either left in the game on purpose, or someone accidentally forgot to take it out before they when they released the final version of the game. Either way, though, it became quite famous. Other games such as Contra also used this. So Gradius is almost certainly the best shoot-em-up on the Famicom so far. There have been really a lot of real mediocre ones, but that is now starting to change. Here are some titles you haven't heard of, I'm sure. These are actually a series of 3 educational games all released on the same day. We'll take a look at them all together. These are all math games. Basically, each game consists of 4 mini-games. Probably the most interesting is this driving one right here. Take a look at the background, you'll see like some pseudo-parallax scrolling. It's actually pretty nice. I don't know who actually developed this game. It was done anonymously. One thing about this game is that sometimes the consequences of getting the wrong answer are actually pretty brutal. For example, in this driving game, if you hit a car, you meet a fiery death. I guess education is taken very seriously in Japan. For the most part, though, these games are not very interesting. You probably won't really want to play them. Naturally, because this is a Japanese game, one of the mini-games involves a penguin playing golf. Obviously, kids love golf, right? These games were published by a company called Tokyo Shoseki. They are not a video game company, but rather a book printer and a textbook publisher. I believe they're one of the largest textbook publishers in Japan, if not the largest. We will see the name crop up from time to time for games on the Famicom, mostly sort of simple games of this variety. We will see more things like this in the future. Rather than making one big game, they simply take a few very basic mini-games and sort of pile them all together. Of course, they still do this nowadays. Games like the WarioWare games, those are actually pretty good, whereas most of these early ones we'll be seeing really aren't that interesting. April 1986's last game was Spy vs. Spy, from the infamous Kemco, the same guys who brought us the terrible game Doughboy. This game was actually developed by First Software, however. In the startup screen here, basically you can choose what level you want to play, versus computer versus player, and if you play versus computer, how smart the computer will be. It also tells you which items you need to find to complete the game. This game was originally developed for American computers in 1984 and had since been ported onto virtually every system known to mankind. I recall it being relatively popular at that time. The Spy vs. Spy video game was inspired by the long-running cartoon in Mad Magazine, created by exiled Cuban cartoonist Antonio Prohías. Prohías' cartoons often had sort of a satirical, anti-communist rhetoric to them. This game doesn't really have anything like that. You most sort of run around and try to find the three items and blow up the other spy if you can. I just planted a bomb inside the painting there. If for some reason he lifts up the painting, he'll get himself blown up, unless he takes precautions first. Once you have everything, you then proceed to the door with the airplane marked on it, and escape. I'm missing, I just found the secret plans, and now I can escape to the airport. It was just sort of a matter of luck that he happened to find them first. I ran into him, killed him, and then took his stuff. And then here's a little end-of-level cutscene where you escape in your plane and the other guy is unable to stop you. Well, that's certainly Spy vs. Spy in a nutshell. I guess you would call it a strategy game, like a lot of American computer games. It wasn't really based on any existing genre. I recall the game being pretty popular. I never really cared for it too much myself. As a rule, I think I personally didn't care that much for computer games. Maybe because they were on computers, I sort of felt that they were secretly like educational games or something like that, even when they were entertaining. Here we see the game at the hardest level setting here in a much larger map. One thing about the larger maps is it's actually, there's so many different rooms, it actually takes you a while to find all this stuff, and sometimes it actually takes you a while before you actually run into your opponent. I almost think the game makes a certain amount of sense in like the more smaller, confined setting where you're much likely to be able to set a trap that he'll run into. I'm sure this game has its fans, I'm not really one of them. One thing about this Famicom conversion is that it does have pretty ugly graphics and really annoying sound effects. Like if you listen to the sound that the spies make when they set a trap or the other guy gets killed, it's supposed to be a laugh, it doesn't really resemble, anything of the sort. And I find the constantly changing colors and screens here to be rather hard on the eyes. But that's just my personal opinion. This game is a lot more fun when played against second person. That's probably how I recommend playing it, but even then, I don't know, it seems you actually seems you spend all your time running around looking in random spots, and the person who actually wins the game is the person who can actually hit the person the fastest when the two spies meet. I have to say this is one of the least interesting titles, in my opinion, released this episode. And this is Seicross, which is another Nichibutsu game. Last episode we saw Magmax, and this game actually seems kind of similar. It is once again a port of an older arcade game from 1984. Here's the arcade version here. As you can see, it's in that same three-quarter view as Magmax. This is sort of a racing game, sort of a shoot-'em-up. I guess it's somewhere in between. The story behind this game is that you are a member of some kind of race of beings that wear blue outfits with baseball caps, and you have been attacked by a bunch of evil bad guys who wear white outfits with motorcycle helmets. Your job is to rescue all your little buddies who are stranded out in the middle of nowhere here, and while you're at it, kill some bad guys and make sure you don't run out of gas. Apparently you use some sort of nuclear power for this bike of yours because the fuel tanks have little radiation symbols on them. Not sure why there are giant rat skeletons laying out in the middle of nowhere. There's only a few levels of this game. Basically you just sort of try to avoid enemies, stay alive, and pick up your little friends if you can. Other than that, it's came to the end of the level here. It's not really that exciting a game. I don't really care too much for this game. It's not really bad, it's not really good. I personally think Magmax is a bit better. On this second level here, there's no enemy motorcycles, but there's various things that shoot at you. So while I'd say there's nothing really wrong with this game, I can't really get too excited about it either. Now here's a game that not only started a very popular franchise in Japan, but virtually initiated an entirely new genre. Nowadays, we often think of Japanese gamers as being totally intoxicated by all these weird little RPGs. Well, this is pretty much the game that started it all. If you're familiar with the US version, Dragon Warrior, you'll notice some of the art is a little different. A few of the sprites were changed, and some of the art was updated for the American release 4 years later. However, before we delve into this game too deeply, let's take a look at the history of video game RPGs up until this point. To find the roots of the RPG genre, you really have to go back more than 50 years to the sword and sorcery novels of Robert E. Howard and the fantasy novels of J.R.R. Tolkien. The works of these authors and their many followers inspired what would now be considered to be the first tabletop RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Not surprisingly, it turns out that some early computer geeks were also D&D fans. Thus, in the 1970s, some very early attempts were made at computer RPGs. Probably the very first commercially available computer RPG was Richard Garriott's Akalabeth. This 1980 game featured first-person wireframe dungeons, very simple combat, and some D&D concepts such as hit points and gold. Another very early RPG was Wizardry. This is a very simple dungeon crawl type game. The object is simply to wind your way through the dungeon and kill the wizard at the end. The first RPG franchise was Richard Garriott's Ultima series, with the first game being released in 1980. As you can see here, the game featured a rather detailed overworld, with mountains, fields, towns, dungeons, and random enemy encounters. In the lower right-hand corner there, you can see this game utilizes experience points, as well as food, a concept that was dropped in most later RPG games. Ultima really provided the template for most later RPGs. This is a top-down view of one of the towns. As you can see, there's a place to buy armor, weapons, food, a bar. This will be very familiar to those of you who have played Japanese console RPGs. Inside dungeons would be the same old first-person wireframe viewpoint. Japanese RPGs would usually utilize a 2D top-down view for dungeons. The thing about first-person dungeons, of course, is that they're often very hard to find your way around in. While the first two Ultima games were quite popular, the game that really expanded the idea of what an RPG could actually be was Exodus, Ultima III. This 1983 computer game really set the bar very high for RPGs, with much better graphics and a much more complicated plot. One thing Ultima III had was separate battle screens, and as you can see here, this is quite influential on later games. You can see here how the screen is divided in half, with the actual graphical element being on one side and various sorts of text and important events being located on the other half of the screen. If you recall Hydlide from last episode, you will remember that the screen looks very much like this. While RPGs like Dragon Quest look a lot better than Ultima III, the core gameplay is really the same. Wandering around on the overworld, entering dungeons, buying armor, buying weapons, leveling up, and of course encountering a lot of random monsters before finally coming across the final boss. However, Japanese game designers really decided to soften or simplify a lot of the RPG elements for these earlier games, with a lot of the more complicated stats and combat options being removed for Japanese games. By 1985, Japanese video game fans were becoming quite fascinated by American RPGs, so it was really only a matter of time before a Japanese company released an RPG of their own. That first game was Dragon Slayer, released for Japanese computers in 1984. In this rather irritating proto-action RPG game, you wander around a dungeon killing monsters and looking for treasure. Falcom followed this game up with Xanadu 1 year later. Xanadu was a side-scrolling affair that made pretty heavy use of character stats. By the way, if these games look good, that's probably because they're actually the MSX versions, which came out a little bit later. They look quite a bit better than the much worse PC-88 versions. Also in 1985, Bulletproof Software released Black Onyx. This is sometimes called the first Japanese RPG, even though it was actually designed by an American. The game is pretty much a standard Wizardry clone. 1985 also saw the original Japanese computer release of Hydlide, a game that we covered last episode. Hydlide was quite a bit more ambitious than Dragon Slayer or Black Onyx, and really sort of established a lot of the conventions of Japanese RPGs. The NES version of Hydlide was the first console RPG. While it might not look like much graphically by today's standards, compared to the Apple II or the MSX games, I'm sure it was very nice looking. Finally, we come to the 1986 game we're looking at right now, Dragon Quest. This was eventually released by Nintendo themselves in 1989 as Dragon Warrior. They couldn't use the name Dragon Quest in the US for copyright reasons, there already being a tabletop RPG with that name. There were some improvements made to the US version. First of all, you can actually save your game as opposed to using passwords. Also, when your character walks around, he now can actually face different directions. In the Japanese version, he would always face the same direction, down. When Japanese gamers first started up this game, one thing they might have found surprising was that the people talk a lot, not just one line like the guys in Zelda would. There's definitely more text in this game than any other Famicom game other than Portopia, which was also from Chunsoft. Now the plot of this game is pretty simple. You need to rescue the princess, find the Dragon Lord's castle, sneak inside and kill the Dragon Lord, thus restoring peace to the country. Of course, in reality it turns out to be a bit more complicated than that. Now, even fans of old-school RPGs might notice just how clunky the interface of this game is. It was borrowed more or less from Portopia, which means in order to do anything, that means go downstairs, talk to someone, open a door, you have to open up a little window and select your option. Later RPGs would make this much smoother by having the action button perform a variety of different context-based actions. Something else you might find annoying in Dragon Quest is in order to open any door, you have to have a magic key. The game gives you one magic key to get out of the king's throne room, but after that you have to find the guy who sells them, buy keys, and then use them, and of course they disappear after only one use. Right away you might notice the locked room with the treasure boxes. You might be thinking, wow, once I get a key I'll have to rush back and open those up, there's probably some good stuff in those. But unfortunately it's not the case. Once you actually open them you'll find a variety of very common objects inside, not really worth the trouble. But the game does indicate you'll have to do some backtracking even from the get-go. So you'll be walking around talking to characters, they'll say various things, sometimes valuable hints or things that advance the plot, or sometimes things just add to the atmosphere and the character of the game. You find the locations of most of the quest items by talking to the NPCs. Around the town you'll find the armor and weapons shop, the inn, where you can rest and restore your hit points and magic points. These shops and inns would of course become standard features in Japanese RPGs. Once you step out into the overworld, you'll notice the Dragon Lord's castle right across the river. Of course, you can't actually just go straight there, you have to wander all around the world and search for items that allow you to build a bridge to the castle. Why you can't just simply build a raft is never made clear. At any rate, you begin by wandering around the overworld, fighting random monsters, and getting experience points and gold. Once you get enough experience points, your level will go up by 1, which will give you more strength, more hit points, and more magic points. Once you're a bit stronger, you then move out a bit further from the original starting point and fight more dangerous monsters. Going too far too quickly will result in you getting killed by more powerful monsters, such as this ghost right here. One thing about the first Dragon Quest is the way it sort of very quickly ramps up the monster difficulty as you start wandering around the overworld, especially once you cross a bridge. You'll find much more powerful monsters on the other side. You can save your game, but the only place this can be done is at the starting castle. This makes it rather inconvenient to have to sort of trot all the way back across the world whenever you want to save your game. Later you'll get a rather convenient return spell, which will allow you to teleport to that castle. Right here I've just raised my character 1 level. One thing about Dragon Quest is, unlike traditional American RPGs, you really can't determine the stats of your character. Everything is pretty much predetermined. For example, once you reach a certain level, you automatically learn the heal spell. You don't buy or choose spells in this game. Altogether, there's around 10 spells in this game. The one you'll be using the most is heal, and then later heal more. There are some offensive spells, but they're really not that useful for the most part. Later Japanese RPGs would make magic a much more important part of the game. Now, Dragon Quest was designed by Yuji Horii and Chunsoft, the same team that did Portopia. And the art and character design was by Akira Toriyama, who is extremely famous in Japan right now for his manga such as Dragon Ball and later Dragon Ball Z. And from what I understand, it was at least partially Toriyama's involvement in the game, which was sort of the initial draw to Japanese gamers to Dragon Quest. To this day, Toriyama still designs the Dragon Quest games. And I really can't emphasize strongly enough just how popular this game was in Japan. It sold over 1.5 million copies, which is pretty amazing for a country the size of Japan. Later installments in this series would rack up even bigger sales numbers. There's even kind of an urban legend that the Japanese government actually banned Onyx from releasing these games on a weekday. While the series hasn't been too successful in the West, Dragon Quest, along with the Final Fantasy games, is perhaps the biggest video game franchise in Japan. The actual world of Dragon Quest I consists of several continents, all sort of separated by rivers and connected by bridges. It's quite a bit larger than that of Hydlide, but it wouldn't take you more than a couple minutes to walk all the way across it if there weren't any random monster encounters. There are 5 dungeons, only 4 of them having monsters inside. Here's one here, and as you can see, the dungeon is in total darkness. You need to use a torch or cast a light spell in order to get around. In this dungeon you actually encounter the dragon of the game, sort of a mid-boss. You need to rescue the princess. He can be quite difficult if you're not strong enough, and one thing about Dragon Quest is the rather unforgiving combat. You only have one character, so a single failed spell, like a failed sleep spell, might result in you getting in quite a bit of trouble. If you try to run away but fail, it's easy to get killed. In other words, luck plays very heavily into the battles in this game. While Dragon Quest is a great game and a very influential game, there are some things that modern gamers might not like. For example, the massive amount of leveling up you have to do in this game. At times, the amount of grinding almost makes Dragon Quest unplayable. This is especially true at certain points, such as right here. At this point in the game, I had basically explored the entire eastern half of the map and was working my way down the western side. At the time, I was right around level 11. However, when I got to this desert, the monsters were far too strong for me to go any further. Keep in mind, I had explored almost the entire world by this point. Beyond the desert, there's only one final town and a few quest items. You can also obtain the strongest armor and shield over here. In order to actually deal with the enemies in the desert and those right after the desert, you'll need to be around level 15. And here's the problem. You hit level 11 at around 2100 experience points. In order to get to level 15, you need 10,000 experience points. That means you need to collect around 7,900 experience points, more than you've collected the entire game so far. The monsters around here tend to average about 25 experience points each, which means you'll need to fight over 350 battles in order to move any further. So the game pretty much grinds to a halt, and there's not really much to do except for wander around in a little circle fighting the same monsters over and over and over again. And furthermore, to actually get to the town, you'll probably want to be around level 16 or 17, which means altogether around 16,000 experience points. And there's really not much to do in this game until you get to that final town. And once you're ready to fight the final boss, you'll need to be at around level 20 or 21, which is perhaps 30,000 experience points. In other words, Dragon Quest makes do a lot of leveling up, especially in the last quarter of the game. This makes the game seem very imbalanced. It seems you'll spend about 90% of your time leveling up as opposed to exploring or going through dungeons. As I said, the world is quite small, only 5 towns and 5 dungeons, so you actually won't get that much experience just wandering around in normal fashion. Most of your experience will come from walking around in a circle, fighting random monsters trying to level up. Additionally, because you only have one character and very little magic, the battles tend to get very repetitive. It's mostly just a slugging match so you can wear down the other's hit points the fastest. The sleep spell and the stop spell come in effective for some monsters, but with most of them it's simply just sort of hit the attack button over and over again. Well, assuming you have the patience to get this far in the game, what you'll be doing is wandering around the world looking for 2 items, the Rain Stick and the Sunstone. Once you've got those, a very helpful magician will help you create a bridge to the final castle. Once you've gotten to the Dragon Lord's castle, you'll have to wander through the last dungeon and then face the most difficult and dangerous monsters in the game. After you've gotten through this rather long and complicated dungeon, you'll meet the Dragon Lord himself. And as I've mentioned, this game can get a bit sadistic at places. When talking to the Dragon Lord, it'll actually freeze your game and you'll have to reset if you give the wrong answers. Furthermore, the first time you fight the Dragon Lord, you'll almost certainly be killed. So you'll then be resurrected, have to level up some more, and then go back and fight him again. One thing about the final boss is that you really can't use any of your magic points before you actually decide to fight him, otherwise he'll kill you. And there is no way to restore your magic points, other than by saving in an inn. so you sort of have to get through the final dungeon without taking really any damage or using any of your magic. You can buy healing items, but your inventory space is so limited, and by the end of the game it'll mostly be taken up by quest items that you can't dispose of. So you won't be able to carry more than a couple healing herbs at any one time. So assuming that you're leveled up, you don't use your magic or take any damage, and get through the dungeon, you'll be battling the Dragon Lord himself. Definitely the toughest enemy in the game, by far. And this game is certainly the first appearance of a sort of now standard Japanese RPG cliché where, oh, you defeated the fake form, but now I shall reveal my true, more powerful form. In this case, it's an actual dragon. So all in all, I'd say that Dragon Quest is one of those games that kind of sits on the fence between brilliant and frustrating. While the game is often fun to play, there are some issues, as I mentioned earlier, that really sort of drain a lot of the fun out of it at times. Of course, the later Dragon Quest games would improve on the formula quite a bit. And remember, this was really the game that set off Japanese RPG mania, and pretty much set the standard for all the Japanese RPGs that followed. So regardless of your own particular feelings about Dragon Quest, its place in video game history has been assured. So we are now in the month of June of 1986, and Nintendo has finally released the third game for the Famicom Disk System. So far they're putting out a new title about once every 2 months. That's not exactly the most promising release schedule. I guess they were planning on making some easy money because the third game is Super Mario Bros. 2. You know, in the past, Nintendo has sort of had this weird thing of making sequels often a lot different than the original game. With this game, they decided to do exactly the opposite. They made Super Mario Bros. About as close to Super Mario Bros. 1 as humanly possible. You just saw the poison mushroom there, one of the new things in the game. There are certainly some changes. The backgrounds are a little bit different. They've done some things a little strange, like adding little faces on everything. This game was actually not directed by Shigeru Miyamoto. He was involved with the game, but the actual director is Takashi Tezuka, sort of one of Miyamoto's right-hand men. He was involved in many of the Mario games, the Zelda games, etc., etc. And this game is not really so much a sequel to the first Super Mario Bros., it's more of a remake. It's basically the same game, only much more difficult. The music is the same, the storyline is the same, you gotta rescue the princess. The basic setup is the game. There's these different worlds, each consisting of 4 sections. Last level is always a little underground dungeon here. At the end of these, of course, you get the same mushroom dude telling you the princess is in another castle. I guess it's really for folks who just wanted some more Mario Brothers that wanted a bigger challenge. Not really a bad game, but perhaps, I don't know, maybe people were expecting something a little different. For whatever reason, perhaps they thought it was too similar to the first game, perhaps they thought it was too difficult for American players, but this game was not released in the United States, at least not for the Famicom. Oh, here we're coming across King Koopa here, rather one of the fake ones. You deal with him just like you did in the first game. A Super Mario Bros. 2 was released in the United States, but it was actually a completely different game. We'll discuss that more once it actually comes out. American players didn't see this until the days of the Super NES. It came out with some other Mario games on the Super Mario All-Stars. At that time it was known as Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. Now, of course, I remember probably a lot of you, as well as myself, played it at that time. Of course, it perhaps seemed like one of the lesser games on the cartridges, perhaps due to the similarity to Super Mario Bros. Also, Super Mario 3, a really good game, was on that as well. So this never really had quite the same nostalgic appeal to me as the other Mario games, but it's certainly a fun game, a lot more challenging. And just like the first Super Mario Bros., it's definitely worth your time. Our final game this episode is Bird Week. This is perhaps not as exciting as Dragon Quest or Super Mario Bros. 2, but in its own way, this is sort of an interesting little game in that it's one of those very early quirky Japanese games. The kind of game that it seems like would only be developed in Japan. Now this game is sometimes referred to as like a nature simulation game, but I don't know if that's accurate or really fair. This game does in no way, shape, or form try to accurately depict what it's like to be a mother bird trying to feed your chicks. It's just a standard video game that happens to use realistic-looking animals. Well, you are the mother bird there, and you have 2 babies on the branch, and the object is to gather up the butterflies and feed them. Once the bird starts jumping around there, that means it's hungry, and you can then grab a butterfly and feed it. Failure to do so will result in the birds dying. If you feed them enough butterflies, it will grow big and fly away, like you just saw there. And then you move on to the next round. Each round, more enemies get added, other than the hawk that flies around extremely slowly. There's like some weird kind of little weasel or something that jumps around trying to catch you. Luckily, the little branch is, for some reason, has some kind of ability to ward off enemies. You can actually land on the branch. One of the enemies can pass right through you and you won't be harmed. What makes this game difficult is not so much the enemies, but rather the little paths that the butterflies follow. They tend to sort of jump around or fly around in like a completely random way, making them sometimes kind of difficult to catch. They also get faster and faster. As you can see, my birds are getting quite agitated there. Oh, yep, you saw an enemy just go right through us. I've been neglecting my chicks, so they're getting quite hungry and are actually about to die of starvation. If nothing else, watching the chicks die is sort of amusing the first time you see it. They kind of collapse at first, and then it's off to bird heaven. Isn't that sad? There's actually a second mode called Study Game. I have no idea what the point of Study Game is, but basically it's where you only play one round. Bird Week has 36 levels. I guess 7 would have made more sense, considering it's called Bird Week. This game is cute, but really nothing to get excited about. I guess it's worth a few minutes of your time. Well, with 2 shoot-em-ups and 3 games involving ninjas, I'd say Chrontendo Episode 8 definitely passed our shoot-em-up ninja theory. I guess we'll have to see how Episode 9 does next time. And you know, as we close out this episode, it's actually with a bit of sadness in my heart. You see, this episode marks kind of a special place in the history of the Famicom. A couple episodes ago I said that with Super Mario Bros., the Famicom left behind its infancy. I guess you could say that with the publication of Dragon Quest, the Famicom has entered its fully grown mature years. You see, between the release of Super Mario Bros. And Dragon Quest, the Famicom was sort of struggling to come up with new ideas and new genres and new types of games that were unique to a home console. Prior to Super Mario Bros., most of the games you saw on the Famicom were things that already existed in some form or another, either in the arcades or on computer systems. Super Mario Bros. Was a new kind of game that created its own sort of unique console-based genre. And I'd say that after that game, there were 3 others. So those 4 games and their respective genres are as follows. First of all, there was Super Mario Bros., which pretty much created the side-scrolling type platformer for consoles. Also, there was Zelda, which basically created the sort of action-adventure / exploration type games. I guess we could call this particular genre the Zelda-esque genre. There was Portopia, which basically initiated the Japanese text adventure genre, though of course we haven't really seen any copies of that yet. They'll be playing in the future, trust me. And now we have Dragon Quest, which basically created the Japanese RPG genre. In other words, you'll find that most of the games we see on the Famicom in the future either come from outside sources such as arcades or computers, the various shoot-'em-ups, run-and-guns, beat-'em-ups, puzzle games, that sort of thing, or there'll be some kind of variation or combination on the 4 games I mentioned earlier. In other words, for the past few months, the Famicom has sort of been feeling around in the dark trying to come up with new things. At this point, those new things have been established, and the rest of the Famicom's history will basically be just sort of variations and permutations on what we've already seen. The Famicom has basically ended its formative years and is now sort of working to perfect the existing genres. For the remainder of its life, we'll see a lot of great games for the Famicom, but we won't see anything quite as new and as fresh as what we've already seen. Regardless, next episode we'll see a game that combined elements from a side-scrolling platformer with an exploration elements from Zelda and came up with one of the all-time greatest games for the Famicom, so I hope I'll see you then.